It began on a quiet evening in London, when a homeowner reported something impossible. A wall that was crying. Not a leak, not a trick of the eye, but real tears, running down plaster as if the house itself remembered something it could not forget. No cracks, only damp stone, and a faint scent of perfume lingering in the air. By morning, a body was discovered behind that very wall, sealed years ago, hidden in silence. And when Sherlock Holmes arrived, he didn't see a haunting. He saw a confession carved into the structure of guilt itself. Because sometimes the walls don't keep secrets, they mourn them. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if mysteries like this stir your imagination, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because each week another case from Baker Street awaits. Now, pick up your cup of tea, sit back, and let's step inside the house that couldn't stop crying. This is Sherlock Holmes and the Wall That Wept. Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was a bleak and rain-lashed morning in the early spring of 1891 when the telegram arrived at Baker Street. I had just set down my cup of tea when Mrs. Hudson entered the sitting room with her usual briskness and handed Holmes the folded note atop a silver tray. As if delivering a summons from the Queen herself, Holmes, who had been seated with his long legs crossed before the fire, barely moved. Only his pale eyes stirred, flickering to the paper with mild curiosity. He did not take it at once, instead continuing to puff thoughtfully at the curved cherrywood pipe between his teeth. A telegram, I observed, attempting to peek at the header. From Scotland Yard. Possibly, Holmes muttered, finally plucking it from the tray and unfolding it in a single flick of his fingers. He read it once and gave the faintest lift of an eyebrow, which, to those who knew him well, signaled the approach of something unusually curious. Well? I asked, setting aside the Times. Holmes leaned back into his chair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. It appears we are being summoned to a chapel. A chapel, I echoed. By whom? Inspector Lestrade, he said, though it seems he is merely the messenger, not the instigator. The true request for our presence comes from Reverend Silas Hargrove, vicar of St. Matthias Church in Shoreditch. And what is the nature of the case? Holmes turned the telegram so I could read it for myself. The message was brief, almost disjointed, but bore that peculiar flavor of urgency I had come to associate with our more unusual inquiries. Murder suspected. Body found in chapel. No sign of entry or exit. Wall dripping blood. No source discovered. Please come at once. Lestrade read the final line twice before looking up at Holmes. A wall dripping blood. Holmes nodded, rising and reaching for his coat in a single, fluid movement. Quite so. And a corpse in a sealed chapel with no sign of entry or exit. My dear Watson, how can we resist? We arrived at St. Matthias within the hour, carried by a rattling cab through the puddled streets of East London. The morning fog had yet to lift, and the iron fences and crumbling gravestones of the churchyard loomed through the mist like silent sentinels. A constable stood at the gate, shoulders hunched against the drizzle, and led us silently inside. The church was a small, humble, ferret stone nave, lit only by pale shafts of gray light filtering through stained glass. Rows of wooden pews stood empty and solemn. The air was damp, with a faint scent of mold and old incense. At the far end, Near the altar stood Lestrade, his bowler in hand, a scowl furrowing his brow. "Holmes." "Doctor," he greeted stiffly. "Quite the situation, this one." Holmes nodded, his sharp gaze already roaming the body. "In the vestry," Lestrade said. "Door was locked from the inside. We had to force it open." He led us through a side corridor lined with stone arches. The vestry door bore clear marks of having been broken, the lock splintered where a crowbar had been driven in. Inside, the room was Spartan oak cupboards, a single desk, a brass crucifix on the wall, and the body. A man lay sprawled, face down on the stone floor, his robes soaked in blood. The wound, clearly fatal, had been dealt to the back of the head, blunt force trauma from something heavy. There were no signs of struggle, no smashed furniture, no broken glass. Just a quiet corpse and a room that should have been impossible to enter or exit. Holmes crouched beside the body, fingertips gently brushing the edge of the robe. "No defensive wounds," he murmured, surprised from behind. "Tell me, Lestrade, how long has he been dead?" "Reverend Hargrove estimates sometime between 7 and 8 this morning. One of the altar boys found the door locked at 8:15 and called for help. We had to break in ourselves." "And the blood on the wall?" Holmes asked without looking up. Lestrade nodded grimly and pointed. "Through there." We stepped back into the chapel, where the far wall behind the pulpit drew our attention immediately. A narrow trickle of red ran slowly down the cold gray stone, thick, glistening, and unmistakably blood. Holmes approached it at once, ignoring Lestrade's warning not to touch anything. He reached into his coat and withdrew a handkerchief, gently dabbing at the trail. "Still wet," he muttered. "And yet—" He turned to the wall itself and began tapping gently with his knuckles, moving from brick to brick. A hollow sound here, a solid one there. Then, abruptly, he stopped and leaned closer. "There is no aperture," he said. "No visible crack or opening. And yet this," he gestured to the blood, "is not the residue of a murder. This was placed here deliberately." "You think someone painted it?" Lestrade asked. "No," Holmes said sharply. "I think someone wanted it to appear as if the very wall were weeping." We stood in silence for a moment, the sound of distant rain tapping against the stained glass above. Holmes stared long and hard at the crimson streak, then turned abruptly on his heel and walked back toward the vestry. "Where is Reverend Hargrove?" he asked. "In his study," said Lestrade. "He's understandably shaken." Holmes paused at the threshold of the vestry and looked back once more at the locked room. "The corpse and the weeping wall, Watson," he said quietly. "Do you recall the case of the card that vanished mid-hand?" I blinked. "You mean the gambler's affair in Brighton?" "Precisely. Deception requires misdirection, and misdirection in a church requires faith." He turned to Lestrade. "Have no one enter or leave. Touch nothing else. Watson and I will speak with the Reverend." As we followed him through the cloistered corridor, I found myself glancing back toward that red-streaked wall, and the corpse that had no killer. The case had begun, and already I could sense that this was no ordinary crime. The chapel might be sacred, but someone had defiled it with a performance of illusion, and Sherlock Holmes was about to tear down the veil. Chapter 2. The consultation in the clergyman's study. The Reverend's study was a modest room tucked behind the east transept, accessible only through a narrow stone corridor that echoed with each of our footsteps. Holmes walked briskly, his eyes flicking to every mark upon the walls, each patch of dampness on the ceiling, as though the very architecture of the church whispered secrets he could already hear. I followed in silence, still ruminating on the impossible nature of the crime. A man murdered in a locked room with no signs of entry, and a wall that bled without explanation. These were elements that defied common sense. And yet Holmes wore that familiar glint in his eye, a gleam that emerged only when a case promised to test the full strength of his intellect. Reverend Silas Hargrove stood when we entered. He was a tall man of perhaps 50, dressed in a rumpled black cassock, his graying hair slicked back from a worried brow. His eyes were sunken and red-rimmed, and his hands trembled as he gestured for us to sit. Inspector Lestrade seemed thoroughly perplexed. As am I. Holmes took the wooden armchair opposite the desk, folding his gloved hands over one knee. I remained standing by the door, notebook in hand. "We came as soon as we could," Reverend Holmes said gently. "I take it you knew the deceased well." Reverend Hargrove swallowed hard. "Yes, that was Mr. Elias Nettle, our church caretaker for 15 years. A loyal man, quiet, devoted. And you discovered the crime yourself?" "No. One of the boys, Peter Cray, found the vestry door locked when he came to prepare the altar candles. When I heard the commotion and came to investigate, Lestrade was already on the scene." Holmes nodded slowly. "Let us begin at the beginning, if you please. Had Mr. Nettle expressed any concerns of late? Had he been unwell, fearful, or in conflict with anyone?" The Reverend leaned back, fingertips pressed together. "Nothing of the sort. He was not a man of excitement. He lived alone in a small flat behind the churchyard gate, came early each morning, often before dawn, to tend the grounds and clean the chapel. He had no family that I knew of, no quarrels with the congregation, none that were ever brought to me." Holmes tapped the arm of his chair lightly. "And the vestry door always kept locked from the inside?" "Always, a rule of Elias. He said he preferred privacy when preparing the vestments and inspecting the inventory. He had the only key. Yet the door was locked when the boy found it. So either the key remains inside." Holmes trailed off, his gaze sharpening. "Yes, Lestrade found it still in Mr. Nettle's pocket," said the Reverend, his voice faltering. "Curious," Holmes muttered, more to himself than to us. He shifted his attention. "And the wall, Reverend? Have you any idea how such an unnatural effect could occur? Has anything like this ever happened before?" The vicar paled. Never in all my years here. I assure you, Mr. Holmes, I do not dabble in superstition. But when I saw that red trail thick as paint, warm to the touch, felt something unholy had passed through this place. It's an old church. Many of the bricks are original to the 17th century. Is it possible the wall contains old piping, a hidden cavity? There is no piping behind that section, nothing save cold stone. We've had no leaks, no construction, no interference of any kind." Holmes was silent a moment, then stood. He walked slowly to a bookshelf against the far wall, running a finger along the spines. His eyes fell upon a faded leather ledger, and he drew it out without asking. "Your church records?" he inquired. "Yes," Hargrove said hesitantly. "That one is old. Inventories, donations, repairs. It goes back decades. Holmes flipped it open and paged through. Scant entries from the early years of Nettle's employment. But here he turned the book toward me and pointed to a notation made in faded brown ink. October 1879. Vestry refurbished. 2 bricks behind altar wall replaced. No further repairs made. Elias Nettle oversaw the work. Holmes closed the book with a soft thump. This brickwork. It is the only alteration to that wall in nearly half a century. I had forgotten entirely, the Reverend murmured. It was before my time. Holmes gave a satisfied nod, returning the volume to its place. Reverend Hargrove, do you know if Mr. Nettle kept any personal effects here? Journals, correspondence. Only a small cabinet in the vestry, he said. The constables have already rifled through it, I believe. No doubt with their usual sensitivity, Holmes murmured, brushing a spot of dust from his sleeve. One more thing. You said Mr. Nettle lived behind the church. Yes, just past the cemetery gate, number 14. Then Watson and I shall pay a visit to his home next. Come, Doctor. As we stepped back into the corridor, the air seemed heavier somehow, as though the weight of the chapel's secrets hung thick upon the stone. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet as we retraced our steps, his brow furrowed in concentration. You are troubled, I said finally. I am intrigued, he replied. A man murdered in a locked room, no signs of struggle, and a wall that bleeds yet bears no wound. All while the only known repair to that section of stone occurred under the hand of the very man now lying dead. But what can it mean? I asked. Holmes stopped short in the cloister and turned to me. It means, Watson, that someone wished to create a miracle, and like all miracles, it requires careful illusion, absolute control, and the gullibility of the faithful. His words sent a chill through me. I glanced once more toward the chapel, somewhere behind its still walls. The truth waited quiet, concealed, and watching, and Holmes, I knew, would find it. Chapter 3. The first clues. A scene of deception. We arrived at St. Matthias shortly before 10 that morning, escorted by Inspector Lestrade, who appeared slightly more irritated than usual. The church stood solemn against the dim gray sky, its brickwork weather-worn, and its narrow stained-glass windows dull with the grime of city air. From the outside, nothing about the chapel seemed unusual, but Holmes always reminded me that appearances were the first, and often the most effective layer of concealment inside. The sanctuary was still cloaked in silence. Reverend Hargrove greeted us at the entrance with a faint nod and ushered us into the nave without ceremony. The scent of incense still lingered faintly in the air, mingling with damp stone and dust. Holmes's eyes, sharp and alert, moved from wall to floor to rafters before the Reverend had spoken a word. Lestrade motioned toward the northern transept. That's where the stain was first noticed. The girl Miss Kilburn reported it, though frankly, I'd say her mind's not entirely steady. Holmes did not respond. He moved immediately toward the far wall, where a faded patch of brick had been marked with chalk by the yardsmen. The stone was darker than its surroundings, discolored as though touched by damp or iron. He knelt beside it and placed a gloved hand gently against the surface. A moment passed. This is not recent, he murmured, more to himself than to us. The seepage began weeks ago, perhaps more. It's bled down and dried, but the trail is consistent, vertical. And yet no source above. He stood and turned to Hargrove. What lies behind this wall? The church's foundation, the Reverend replied hesitantly. Beyond its stone, mostly, structural supports. No known chambers. Holmes arched an eyebrow. No known chambers is not the same as none at all. He paced the length of the wall slowly, eyes drifting over the mortar lines and tiny irregularities between the bricks. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual. Lonely age and the work of time. Holmes then turned his attention to the ground at the base of the wall. He knelt again, this time drawing out a magnifying lens and brushing his fingers lightly across the floor. There's a fine powder here, he said, mixed with what appears to be dried sap, or blood, you see, Watson, a faint reddish tinge just along the seam. I bent to inspect it myself. To my eye, it looked like the residue of dust and old wax from countless candles, but Holmes had long taught me that the obvious was often misleading. And what of this? He added, pointing to a faint mark on the flagstone, a circular scuff, shallow but clearly not natural. Lestrade frowned. We found nothing more. The scuff could be from a chair leg or the end of a staff. Reverend, I've never noticed it before, Hargrove said, looking visibly uneasy. But then, this part of the chapel is seldom used. Holmes rose to his full height and dusted his coat. Curious, he said quietly. A wall that weeps without water, a stain with no source, and a ground marked where no furniture stands. He turned suddenly. Have the floor plans changed in recent decades? The Reverend blinked. I don't believe so. Not since the renovations in 1869, but the plans are in the vestry cabinet. Should you wish to see them? We do, Holmes replied. We were led through a narrow hallway into the vestry, a long, low room lined with wooden cabinets, clerical robes, and a wide oak table in the center. The air was colder here. Reverend Hargrove pulled open a drawer and laid out a thick, folded parchment. Holmes spread it across the table. This is the original layout, the Reverend said. You can see the nave, altar, baptistry. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he examined the area behind the northern transept. His finger traced a line to a shaded box beside the wall in question. There, what is this space? The Reverend leaned closer. I'm not sure. It's unlabeled. Perhaps an error in the drawing. Holmes looked up sharply. Architects do not shade spaces in error. This suggests a void, a cavity. Lestrade stepped closer, peering down with furrowed brow. A hidden room, then. Perhaps, Holmes said, or a passage, or something bricked up long ago. He folded the map carefully and handed it back. I'll need copies of any records from the renovations, the names of those involved, especially, and if you can recall, Reverend, whether there were any issues or disturbances during construction. The Reverend's face had gone pale. There were murmurs, he said slowly. Old stories passed from one vicar to the next. Nothing official, but something about a scandal. A servant girl, perhaps, and the bishop, Bishop Harrow, I asked, surprised. Holmes nodded, clearly unsurprised. The very man whose portrait hangs above the altar. We left the vestry shortly after. Outside, the clouds had thickened again, and a fine mist fell over the street. Holmes paused at the church gate, deep in thought. Watson, he said at last, there is a wall that weeps without rain, a girl who sees a ghost where others see silence, and a record of a room that should not exist. And what does it all mean? He gave me a sideways glance. It means, my dear fellow, that something was hidden long ago, something the stones have not quite forgotten. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. Later that day, after a brief luncheon in Soho, Holmes and I returned to St. Matthias for the promised interviews. Reverend Hargrove had arranged for several individuals connected to the church to be present, those who had either reported strange occurrences or were present during the time of the renovations some 20 years ago. Holmes had a particular gleam in his eye, the kind that usually signaled a tightening of the net. I could feel it too. The air was thick with a peculiar tension, as if the stones of the chapel themselves were listening. We were first introduced to Agatha Kilburn, the young woman who had first reported the mysterious stain on the wall. She appeared pale and somewhat nervous, her hands constantly folding and unfolding in her lap. She avoided Holmes's gaze and answered questions with a halting voice. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said. I heard something. A sound like weeping. It came from behind the wall. I was sure of it." Holmes regarded her kindly. "And what did others say when you told them?" "They thought I was ill," she whispered. "That I was imagining it. But I swear to you, sir, I wasn't." Holmes nodded gently. "You are not mad, Miss Kilburn. But those who wish to hide the truth often make sanity the first casualty." Next, we spoke with Mrs. Edith Levington, a formidable widow in her late 60s, with a sharp jaw and a voice that suggested a lifetime of command. She had served as treasurer of the parish for over 2 decades and was considered the unofficial matriarch of the church's inner circle. "I don't see what use all this is," she said crisply as she sat down in the vestry. "The church is old, Mr. Holmes. Old buildings crack and bleed. You chase ghosts when there are none." Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet, ghosts have a habit of lingering near those who knew them best. Tell me, Mrs. Levington, what do you recall of the renovation in 1869? She stiffened, eyes narrowing slightly. "I was only recently married to Bishop Harrow at the time. It was a minor expansion, nothing more. The north wall was reinforced, that's all. And the workmen?" Holmes pressed. "Were there any reports of unusual findings?" She gave a cool laugh. "Builders are always full of stories. Rats, bones, secret tunnels of old churches. None of it ever meant anything." As we prepared to leave the vestry, Holmes paused. His eyes narrowed toward the far end of the room, where a narrow wooden cabinet stood beneath a stained glass panel depicting the martyrdom of St. Matthias. Something about the angle of the cabinet, or perhaps its position along the eastern wall, seemed to displease him. Without a word, he strode toward it and ran his fingers along the base. "Curious," he muttered. I followed, puzzled. "What is it?" He tapped his cane gently against the floor beside the cabinet. The sound rang dull and hollow, not like the rest of the flagstone flooring. He knelt and examined the floorboards more closely. Then, without ceremony, he grasped the cabinet by its side and shifted it 2 inches to the left. A seam in the wall was now visible, hairline, nearly imperceptible but definite. Holmes stood slowly. "The church's structure has been altered, not simply reinforced. This wall has been tampered with, its base freshly mortared at some point in the last 20 years. Reverend Hargrove had re-entered just in time to see Holmes dusting his hands off. His face paled. "Mr. Holmes, what are you suggesting?" "That someone not only concealed a room, but took great care to ensure it could not be found," Holmes replied calmly. "And yet," he added, gesturing to the faint seam, "they underestimated the quiet honesty of stone." The Reverend looked shaken. "Surely you're not implying that something sinister lies behind it?" "I imply only that secrets leave scars," Holmes said, "and this church bears more than its fair share." We returned that evening to Baker Street, though Holmes remained in an uncharacteristically quiet mood. He reclined in his chair, staring at the ceiling, hands steepled beneath his chin. The glow of the fire cast strange shadows against the bookshelves. Outside, fog had begun to rise from the Thames, curling around lampposts like ghostly fingers. I couldn't help but ask, "What is it, Holmes? Something troubles you?" He didn't speak at once. When he did, his voice was low and thoughtful. "There is a sense, Watson, that we are walking into a performance already written where every actor knows their role, but no one speaks their lines aloud. Each of our suspects wears a mask. The widow Levington plays the protector, the Reverend the reluctant custodian. Even the girl, Miss Kilburnshire, sees more than she admits, yet trembles like a leaf caught in the tide." I nodded. "And Mr. Marley, a man worn down by guilt," Holmes said, "though the shape of it remains unclear. He has seen something, or done something, perhaps both. He watches the wall like a sentinel guarding a grave no one remembers." Holmes stood then and paced to the window. He pushed aside the curtain and stared out into the fog-drenched street. "There is a design in this," he said softly. "Something buried not only beneath the church, but beneath layers of silence, shame, and fear. This is no ordinary case, Watson. The dead do not merely linger here. They accuse." I felt a chill despite the fire that night. As the wind whistled faintly through the city's chimneys and gaslights flickered like tired eyes, Holmes penned a single letter addressed to the Office of Ecclesiastical Records. He requested access to the private correspondences of Bishop Harrow, as well as documentation of a certain incident involving a servant girl in the year 1869. He sealed it with wax and handed it to me. "Post this tonight, Watson, and ask no questions for now." I took the letter with a nod and stepped out into the night. The streets of London cloaked in an unnatural hush. Behind me, Baker Street glowed softly in the fog, and Holmes remained framed in the window, his silhouette sharp, unmoving, like a watchman gazing into some distant ruin only he could see. And as I dropped the letter into the post-box, a strange and inexplicable thought occurred to me. It was not just the wall that wept something in the church itself, beneath the bricks, behind the prayers, beneath centuries of carved stone and candle smoke was mourning. And Holmes. Holmes was listening. Holmes studied her for a moment, then changed course. "And Elias Nettle, you knew him?" Her smile faltered vaguely. "He was a strange man, always digging into things best left buried. It's unfortunate what happened to him, but I can't say I'm surprised." We moved on to the third interview, the aging church caretaker, Mr. Walter Marley. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, and he moved with difficulty, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that defied his years. "I remember the renovations," he said, nodding slowly. "Was just a lad then, apprenticing under the senior caretaker. They closed off that end of the church for weeks. Said the foundations were unstable. I saw things, though. Men cartin' off stones in silence. Heard talk 'bout a sealed space. Did you speak of it to anyone? Holmes asked. He gave a grim chuckle. And be dismissed for gossiping? No, sir, not I, but I reckon now. There was something they were told not to speak of, something left behind the wall. Holmes leaned forward. And do you believe the wall weeps? The old man looked straight at him. I believe the dead don't sleep easy when buried without a name. The last to be questioned was Elias Nettles' landlord, a nervous little man named Mr. Chambers, who owned a small flat not far from the chapel. Odd fellow, Mr. Nettle, he told us. Kept to himself mostly, but he was always scribbling, always reading old books and maps. Said he was working on a history of the church. He came back one night looking pale. Said he'd found something that would make everything make sense. And did he tell you what it was? I asked. Chambers shook his head quickly. No, he said he wanted to be sure first. Then the next morning he was dead. Fell from his stairwell. At least that's what they said. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Did he seem frightened or determined? Chambers hesitated. Both. As we left the chapel later that afternoon, the sky had turned a deeper gray. Holmes walked silently, hands behind his back, his brow creased in thought. These people know more than they admit, Watson, he said finally. Mrs. Levington in particular. Her defensiveness is not rooted in fear, but in preservation. Preservation of what? I asked. He glanced at me. Reputation, perhaps. Power, or simply the memory of a man she once loved. Bishop Harrow's legacy is a fragile one, and legacies are easily undone by the truth. We passed the stone wall once more on our way out. Holmes paused before it, pressing his palm lightly against the brick. This wall hides more than decay, he murmured. It hides intent. And as we walked back into the London mist, I could not shake the feeling that the church itself was holding its breath, waiting, listening. Remembering. Chapter 5. The first suspect, a convenient solution by. The fourth morning after the crime at St. Matthias, it seemed Scotland Yard had declared the matter closed. As I stepped into our sitting room at Baker Street, a folded newspaper still in hand, I found Holmes standing at the window, his tall figure silhouetted against the gray light streaming through the thin curtains. I had barely opened my mouth to speak when he turned his head slightly and said, "They've arrested someone." His voice was flat, without curiosity. "Yes," I replied, holding up the paper. "Simon Wren, the organist. Lestrade says the case is all but solved. They found the supposed murder weapon in the organ loft, a wrench, stained with blood. The Reverend sent word as well. It's in the news now. 'Chapel Killer Caught,' the headline reads. Rather bold for a case not a week old." Holmes let out a breath, more sigh than speech, and turned away from the window. He began pacing the room, slow and deliberate, with his hands clasped behind his back. "Simon Wren," he repeated. "An unmarried man, no debts, no scandal, soft-spoken and punctual. The sort of fellow who tucks his collar just so. Do you believe such a man, who volunteers to teach children hymnals, bludgeoned Elias Nettle to death in a locked vestry, planted no trace but a single bloodied wrench, and then returned to rehearsal without a tremor?" I gave a short shrug. The evidence seems rather direct. Holmes shook his head. It seems convenient. A wrench with his name engraved. Blood in all the right places. And yet no one heard a scream. No trail of footsteps. No reason why the wall bled after the man had supposedly been killed. Watson, if I were to frame a man in haste, I could hardly devise a better scapegoat than Simon Wren. That afternoon, despite a steady drizzle, Holmes insisted we return to St. Matthias. He was determined to see the supposed crime scene once more with fresh eyes. When we arrived, Lestrade was already on the church grounds, his bowler hat tilted low against the rain, and a self-satisfied look plastered across his narrow face. He greeted us with a smirk that suggested the case, in his mind, was as good as sealed. "Well, Holmes," Lestrade said, not bothering to hide his smugness, "if you've come to poke holes in solid police work, you'll be disappointed. Wren's as guilty as a man can be. The Reverend himself confirms there was tension. Seems our victim warned Miss Kilburn Church, soprano and Wren's sweetheart, that her good name would suffer if she continued the attachment. Nettle had strong opinions about decorum. Too strong, perhaps." Holmes raised a brow, but said nothing. Lestrade continued. "They quarreled. Miss Kilburn overheard the argument. Wren's wrench found behind the organ curtain, blood on it, clear as day. The motive, love, the means. Obvious. The opportunity. He had access. You'll forgive me if I don't call that subtle." Holmes finally spoke. "And did Wren confess?" "No," Lestrade admitted, with a small frown. "Claims he used the wrench weeks ago, forgot it there. But we both know that story." Holmes gave a short nod. "Indeed convenient, too convenient." Despite Lestrade's protests, Holmes insisted on inspecting the organ loft. We climbed the narrow stairs to the gallery above the nave, where the enormous organ pipes stood like metal towers against the wall. The curtain where the wrench had supposedly been discovered hung limply to one side, slightly lifted at the hem. Holmes crouched low, inspecting the floor beneath. His fingers brushed the wood gently. Then he produced his lens and studied the dust. "The wrench may have rested here," he said quietly, "but not long. The dust is disturbed only in one place, just enough for someone to have placed the item, not dropped it in haste." He rose and walked to the organ console itself, running his fingers across the ivory keys, then the stops. He paused at one labeled tremulant and pulled it halfway out. "Curious," he murmured. I stepped closer. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tapped the wood around the stop and pulled it fully. A low, hollow vibration echoed from within the pipes. Holmes leaned in, almost listening to the internal workings of the instrument. "It has been tampered with," he said at last. "This stop doesn't behave as it should. It has been partially disconnected." Lestrade, who had trailed us with visible impatience, scoffed. "You think the organ was used as a weapon?" "No," Holmes said sharply. "Not a weapon. A stage. The wall bleeds. The body appears behind a locked door, and a wrench lies waiting, labeled like a theater prop. The killer did not wish to hide the crime. He wanted it seen. But he also needed a narrative one that fit a man like Simon Wren." As we left the loft, Holmes paused one final time to glance down at the pulpit. The streak of dried blood on the wall remained faint. No attempt had yet been made to scrub it. Holmes stared at it with a look I had come to recognize half disdain, half calculation. Back in the courtyard, the drizzle had thickened into a steady rain. Holmes stood under the church arch and lit a cigarette, shielding it from the wind. "You don't believe Wren is guilty?" I said. "No," Holmes replied. "His very neatness condemns the case against him. When guilt appears wrapped in paper and tied with twine, one should look to the sender, not the parcel." I frowned. "Then who?" Holmes looked out into the foggy street, his expression unreadable. "We have seen only the surface, Watson. Behind the locked door and the weeping wall lies something deeper, layers of performance, misdirection, and motive. Until we understand why a miracle was staged in a house of faith, we will never know who stood behind the curtain." And with that, he tossed the cigarette to the cobblestones, and we stepped back into the mist. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A hidden inconsistency. 2 days passed without public update. Yet the news cycle continued to fan the embers of certainty around Simon Wren's arrest. The headlines painted him as a jealous man driven to madness by moral judgment, a lone figure who had supposedly murdered Elias Nettle in a fit of rage and left behind the odd, bloody spectacle as either symbolism or some twisted confession. Holmes, however, remained unconvinced. He said little, preferring instead to linger by the fire with a book unopened on his lap, or to take short, brooding walks through the fog-laced streets of Marylebone, speaking only in mutters. When I joined him on the morning of the 6th day, he emerged from his bedroom unusually early, dressed and alert, and announced that we would be returning once more to Elias Nettle's quarters behind St. Matthias. "We must find the inconsistency," he said without elaboration. "The story has moved too quickly, too smoothly. Someone has taken pains to construct a sequence of events, and it is time we pull at the threads before they settle into fact." Nettle's rooms were modest, as befitting a man of frugality and routine, located in a small brick building tucked behind the church cemetery. The apartment bore the faint scent of chalk, old leather, and candle smoke. The constables had already searched the space, though not, it seemed, with any real diligence. Books remained stacked beside the armchair. Several drawers in the writing desk were still locked, and there was a thin layer of dust on the windowsill that even I, with my untrained eye, could see had not been disturbed. Holmes moved slowly through the room, trailing a finger across surfaces, pausing often, frowning slightly. I stood nearby, watching him examine the hearthstones, the cupboard shelves, the brass lamp on the nightstand. Finally, he turned to the writing desk, produced a thin metal pick from his inner coat pocket, and within moments had lifted the latch on the locked drawer. Inside lay an orderly arrangement of papers, church receipts, repair invoices, a stack of prayer leaflets, and a worn brown envelope with Nettle's name written in a cramped hand. Holmes opened it and removed its contents with care. What emerged was a folded letter, yellowed with age, and a small hand-drawn map. He read quickly, eyes narrowing with every line. "What is it?" I asked. He handed me the letter without a word. The script was shaky, unsigned, and dated nearly 14 years prior. "You were right to seal it, but sealing is not the same as forgetting. If she finds out what's beneath the wall, it will destroy the ministry. We all swore to leave it untouched. We gave our word, Elias. Let the dead rest and the stone speak nothing. If you unbury what we buried, You will not just answer to mule, answer to him. I looked up, startled. This refers to the altar wall. Holmes nodded. And this map, look. He unfolded it beside the letter. The hand-drawn sketch outlined the chapel's interior with surprising detail. A small red X was marked behind the pulpit, precisely where the blood had appeared. But more strikingly, there were faded lines drawn beneath it, indicating something hidden beneath the bricks. It appears, Holmes murmured, that there's a cavity behind that section of the wall. Something once buried, or perhaps still buried, but 14 years ago. That's long before the murder. Indeed, Holmes replied. This note, Watson, is not just a warning. It's a confession of secrecy. Something Nettle knew, something buried with intention, then forgotten, or perhaps remembered just in time to get him killed. We returned to the chapel that afternoon. Holmes did not inform Lestrade of our visit, preferring instead to make a quiet examination while the building was closed for evening cleaning. The church was dim, empty of parishioners, with the faint scent of polish lingering in the air. Holmes moved to the altar wall and knelt before the section marked on the map. He placed both palms flat against the stone, tapping lightly with his knuckles, ears tuned to the faint reverberation of hollow versus solid. There, he said, pointing to the fourth brick from the bottom. Feel. I crouched beside him and tapped it myself. The stone gave a dull, hollow response, unlike the firm knock of the surrounding masonry. Help me lift it, he whispered. It took several minutes of gentle probing with a narrow tool from Holmes's coat, but eventually the brick shifted. Behind it was darkness. Holmes reached inside and pulled free a small cloth pouch tied at the neck with fraying twine. He opened it carefully and outspilled 3 items: a tarnished silver crucifix, a locket encrusted with soot, and a bundle of tightly folded papers. Yellow with age, he read the first page in silence, then passed it to me. May God forgive me for what I have done. I buried her beneath his house to protect his name. If truth is light, then let this remain in darkness. I stared at the words, stunned. Buried. Holmes, are these papers admitting to a crime? It would seem so, he replied, his voice distant. But whose crime? And whose truth was being protected? This was not Elias Nettle's handwriting. No, this was written by someone else, someone older, perhaps even one of the clergy before Hargrove's time. He stood slowly, his gaze fixed on the hollow in the wall. This is the inconsistency, Watson. The wall weeps not from recent wounds, but from long-concealed guilt. Nettle must have discovered this cache. Perhaps he planned to reveal it, or perhaps someone feared he would. Either way, the past rose like a ghost, and the blood that appeared was no miracle, it was a warning. We replaced the brick and left the chapel silently. Outside, the sun had begun to set behind the spire, casting long shadows across the churchyard. Holmes remained quiet as we walked, his mind clearly working through the new implications. Finally, as we turned onto the main road, he said, "The wrench, the wall, the sealed vestry, all distractions, Watson. The real story lies not in the murder itself, but in what Elias Nettle unearthed just before he died. The chapel hides more than a body, and someone is willing to kill to keep it hidden." Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The next morning arrived under a sky the color of tarnished pewter, and with it came a knock at the door. that disturbed the quiet of Baker Street far earlier than usual. Holmes had not slept, nor had he spoken much since our return from the church the night before. He had remained seated at his desk well into the small hours, poring over the bundle of yellowed papers found behind the altar brick, rereading them by candlelight, as if trying to divine their meaning through sheer force of will. When I opened the door to admit Reverend Hargrove, I saw at once the man was in distress. His usually composed manner was gone. His cassock was askew, his eyes red with sleeplessness, and his hands trembled as he removed his hat. "Mr. Holmes, I came at once. There's been another terrible discovery," he said, his voice dry and brittle. "It's not over. The wall this time, another part weeps again." Holmes rose immediately, coat already in hand. "Where?" "The north transept, just beside the old bell tower door. I saw it myself not 20 minutes ago. It wasn't there yesterday. The mark is fresh." Without another word, we followed him into the street and secured a hansom cab. The ride was tense and silent, save for the clatter of wheels. Holmes sat with his eyes shut, but I knew better than to think he was resting. His mind, sharp and tireless, was already turning over the possibilities. When we arrived, the church grounds were empty, save for a few shocked parishioners who loitered near the gates, whispering. One woman crossed herself as she looked up at the building inside. The air felt colder than it should have for late spring. The Reverend led us through the nave to the northern transept, stopping just before the tall, narrow door that led to the disused bell tower. And there it was, a fresh trail of red running down the gray stone wall, as if the building itself were bleeding. It was thinner than the first mark by the altar, but unmistakable in its intensity. Holmes stepped forward immediately, removing a small glass vial from his coat. "Has anyone else been inside this morning?" he asked. "No," the Reverend replied. "I'm always the first here. I come to light the lamps and prepare for morning prayer. I found it just after unlocking the doors." Holmes scraped a sample of the red substance into the vial. "No sign of forced entry. Nothing disturbed." "Nothing I could see," said the Reverend. Holmes studied the mark closely, his eyes narrowing. "This is different," he muttered. "The angle, the thickness, the color slightly brighter. This was not left by time. This was applied within the last hour." "Then someone entered the church unseen?" I asked. "Or never left," Holmes replied grimly. He turned sharply to Hargrove. "I need the keys to the bell tower now." The Reverend hesitated, clearly uneasy. "It hasn't been opened in years." "Then it's time we changed that." With some fumbling, the Reverend produced a heavy iron key and handed it over. The lock on the tower door groaned with age, but eventually turned. Holmes pushed the door open, and we were met with a gust of cool, musty air. A narrow staircase spiraled upward into darkness. Holmes led the way, lantern in hand, his footfalls deliberate and silent. The climb was tight and treacherous, the stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use at the top. We entered a small, dust-choked chamber beneath the great bell itself. Wooden beams crossed the ceiling, cobwebbed and splintering. Empty crates lined the wall. A rusted chair leaned in the corner, and an old ledger sat on a half-broken shelf. Holmes walked slowly through the space, his lantern catching the glint of something small on the floor. He stooped and picked up a broken pencil, fresh, not old. The lead had snapped, and the shavings beside it were bright against the dusty floorboards. "Someone was here recently," he said. "Someone writing, or perhaps sketching." He walked over to the ledge and inspected the stone sill beneath the window. There, etched faintly into the grime, were a few curved lines-arcs and loops that suggested the start of a drawing. Holmes frowned, brushing the dust aside with his sleeve. "It's incomplete," he said. "But someone came up here to observe, or perhaps prepare something." A sudden knock from below made us all jump. It was Lestrade, looking harried and pale as he met us at the foot of the tower. "Holmes," he said, without preamble, "we've a problem. Simon Rennie's been attacked in his cell." My heart lurched. Attacked? By whom? Lestrade shook his head. "They don't know. The constable on duty swears no one entered the cell. But Wren was found unconscious, with blood on his hands and a mark on his cheek. Looked like some kind of brand." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "A brand?" "Yes, a circle with a small cross inside it, burned into his skin. God knows how." Holmes glanced at me, then back to Lestrade. "The same symbol was etched into the documents we found behind the altar wall." Lestrade blinked. "You're saying it's connected?" "I'm saying," Holmes said coldly, "that Wren is not the author of this madness. He's a target of it. And now that he's been silenced, our time is running out." As we exited the church, the clouds hung heavier overhead, the threat of rain thick in the air. Holmes lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, a rare show of agitation. He didn't speak for a long moment, then turned to me slowly. "There's someone still inside the church, Watson. Not just physically, but historically. A presence that's woven itself into the fabric of its stones." Nettle's death was the first response to an old secret resurfacing. But the second blood on the wall, that's a warning. We're trespassing in something older than murder. I looked up at the ancient spire of St. Matthias, its shadow stretching long across the damp earth. Somewhere within that sacred space, someone was watching guiding events from behind the curtain like a puppet master with a flair for the dramatic. And Holmes, with each layer of deception pulled away, was inching closer to a truth even he wasn't certain he wanted to find. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. Holmes was unusually quiet on the return to Baker Street. He didn't glance at the evening traffic outside the cab window nor answer my cautious questions. His fingers drummed lightly against the inside of his coat, as if trying to summon order from the chaos. I had seen him like this before, when a puzzle turned inside itself and refused the straight path of logic. But in this case, it was more than mere mystery. There was something in his eyes that suggested a touch of unease, even dread. The kind of emotion Holmes rarely allowed to surface unless a case brushed too near the edge of something personal or profound. Once inside our flat, he went straight to his writing desk and opened the drawer where the relics from the altar wall had been carefully stored. He spread the bundle of papers and the hand-drawn map out before him, arranging them in a precise semicircle across the wood. Then, without speaking, he pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing notes, cross-referencing dates and names, sketching the same odd symbol that had been burned onto Simon Wren's cheek, a circle with a cross inside. Not quite religious, not quite pagan. I watched from the fireside chair, the light from the hearth flickering across his face. "You believe this symbol is at the heart of it all?" I asked. "I believe," he said slowly, that it is not simply a mark of cruelty, but a seal, a warning sign, a boundary crossed. This was not a murder born of passion or profit. What's in it was ritualistic, precise, and more importantly, meant to communicate something. Every part of this case has been staged. Nettle's death, the blood on the wall, Wren's branding, they're not acts of violence alone. They are a language. He stood up suddenly, knocking back his chair, and moved to the bookshelf. After a moment of scanning the spines, he pulled down an old volume, thick with dust and cracked leather binding. The Esoterica of English Ecclesiastical Symbols. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was searching for. Here, he said, holding the book open to a woodcut illustration. This symbol, the circle with the cross. It was used in the 17th century by a secret society within the church, a brotherhood of monks and priests who believed certain sins, committed on holy ground, could be hidden from God's sight by sealing them behind walls. They would mark these places with the circle of silence to signify a spiritual barrier no truth could pass through, no forgiveness be given without confession. I stared at the image, chilled. You think the church still bears these secrets? Holmes's eyes glittered. No, Watson. I think someone inside that church knows about them. And I believe that person has used this old ritual language to mask a very modern crime. A person with knowledge of the building's history, its shadows, its locked places. Perhaps even someone who sees themselves as its guardian. He paced once, then stopped sharply. We must go back, but not to investigate. This time we must provoke. Provoke. Holmes nodded. I intend to draw our hidden hand into the open, but to do so, I'll need to place myself figuratively and physically in the center of the performance. The following morning, with the help of Reverend Hargrove, Holmes staged a small meeting in the chapel, claiming he wished to deliver a formal report of his findings thus far. Present were the Reverend Miss Agatha Kilburn, the church's elderly caretaker, Mr. Marley, and Lestrade, whom Holmes had reluctantly invited to give the meeting an air of authority. I sat beside Holmes in the front pew, unsure of his plan, but sensing already that something unspoken was in motion. Holmes began by recounting the details of the case with a calm, almost detached tone. He mentioned the wrench, the vestry, the blood-stained wall, and the note found in Nettle's drawer. He touched briefly on the mysterious symbol, allowing the gathered audience to hear it aloud. But as he spoke, I noticed how he watched them all, not with the eyes of a lecturer, but with those of a hunter. He was testing reactions, looking for the smallest twitch of the hand, the flicker of a gaze, the tightening of a jaw. When he mentioned the map showing a hollow behind the altar wall, I saw Agatha Kilburn pale visibly. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, seemed to tremble ever so slightly. She quickly glanced down as though afraid her expression had betrayed something. Holmes, catching the motion, lingered on her face just long enough for me to see he had made note of it. But he said nothing further. He simply concluded his account and announced he would be staying at the church that evening to observe whether the bleeding wall phenomenon repeated itself. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. You're going to sleep here? Holmes nodded. I wish to see what the church reveals when no one is watching. Or rather, when someone thinks no one is. That night, after the chapel had emptied and the doors were locked, Holmes and I took up quiet positions within the shadows of the nave. He refused any lanterns or candles, preferring darkness. We sat on opposite ends of the pews, hidden from view, with only the faint moonlight filtering through the stained glass to illuminate the worn stone walls. For nearly 3 hours, nothing stirred. The silence was deep and thick, broken only by the creaks of settling wood and the occasional whisper of wind through the cracks in the doors. Then, just past 2 o'clock, I heard a footstep, soft, measured. From my position I could see the northern transept, and I strained to glimpse any movement. Holmes, somewhere to my left, did not move. The footfalls stopped. Then came a faint scraping sound, stone against stone. My heart thudded as I slowly turned my head. A figure stood near the wall, hooded, bent forward. They held something in their hand, pressing it to the bricks. Then came another sound like the trickle of liquid. The wall began to darken. Holmes stood suddenly, his voice cutting through the dark like a blade. "That will be quite enough, Miss Kilburn." The figure froze, then bolted, but Holmes was already upon her. In the dim light I saw the hood fall, revealing Agatha's wide, stricken eyes. In her hand was a bottle, dark liquid sloshing inside. Holmes twisted it from her grasp as Lestrade and I hurried to join him. "It's stage blood," Holmes said, holding up the bottle, "mixed with glycerin and pigment, used in theatrical productions to mimic fresh wounds. You applied it to the wall to maintain the illusion of the church's suffering." Agatha sank to her knees, face pale. "I didn't kill him," she whispered. "I swear I didn't kill Elias." "No," Holmes said quietly, "but you knew who did, and you tried to make it look like something else, something ... sacred," as she wept silently against the cold stones. Holmes stood over her face, unreadable, it appears. "Watson," he said softly, "the play is nearly over, but the author remains behind the curtain." Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again despite her late-night arrest. Agatha Kilburn was not taken to the station immediately. Holmes insisted she remain at the vicarage under the Reverend's watch until Scotland Yard could conduct a full interrogation. She had confessed only to staging the blood marks on the church wall, insisting again and again she had no part in Elias Nettle's death. Holmes seemed inclined to believe her, though not from sympathy. His interest in her role, as he explained to me the next morning over a sparse breakfast, had less to do with guilt and more to do with fear. "She is no murderer, Watson," he said, setting down his tea untouched. "But she is frightened of someone. That much is clear. What compels a woman to pour imitation blood onto church walls in the dead of night? Not madness. She is not unhinged. It is fear. And fear, as we know, often traces back to the root of a crime more surely than any footprint." Before I could respond, a sharp knock came at the door, followed by Lestrade's voice calling up the stairs. We both rose instantly. Holmes had sensed it already, that uneasy silence that precedes bad news. As we opened the door, Lestrade's face confirmed it. "There's been another attack," he said, "and this time someone nearly died." We followed him swiftly through the fog-wrapped streets. This time our destination was not the church, but the caretaker's, Cottagemeister Marley's quarters, located just behind the garden shed that bordered the chapel cemetery. The air was heavy with dew, and the trees lining the path dripped like they had wept through the night. When we arrived, 2 constables stood outside the door, grim-faced. Inside, Mr. Marley lay stretched across a makeshift cot in the small sitting room, his shirt open at the collar and blood staining the corner of his mouth. A physician stood nearby, dabbing his forehead with a cloth. "He's alive," the doctor muttered, "but barely. Someone struck him from behind. Blunt object, clean blow. Had it been an inch lower, it would have crushed his spine. As it is, he'll be unconscious for some time." Holmes examined the room quickly, eyes sharp and moving like a hawk's. Nothing appeared stolen. There were no signs of a struggle. No broken glass, no furniture overturned. Yet one thing stood out. A book had been pulled from the shelf and left open on the ground. Holmes picked it up and turned it toward the light. It was a parish registry from nearly 2 decades past. The pages were brittle, the ink faded. Holmes traced one finger down a column of names and dates before shutting it firmly. "He knew something," Holmes said quietly. "Or rather, remembered something. Perhaps he had grown uneasy since the night of the murder. Perhaps he had begun to piece it together, and some 1-houred true culprit couldn't risk that memory becoming speech." Lestrade was frowning. "You think the same person who killed Nettle tried to silence the caretaker?" "I am certain of it," Holmes replied. "But this time the strike was rushed, crude, desperate. That is always the mark of a criminal under pressure. The illusion is beginning to slip, and they know it." He stepped out into the early morning light, his coat flaring behind him like a shadow. I followed him into the graveled path between the chapel and the caretaker's garden. The sun had just begun to rise, casting pale gold along the dew-covered stones. Holmes stopped abruptly and pointed. "Look here." In the soil near the garden's edge, 2 distinct boot prints had sunk deep into the earth, far deeper than the surrounding area. Holmes crouched beside them, measuring the length and width with a practiced glance. "Too large for Miss Kilburn, too clean for the gardener, whose boots I saw yesterday caked with layers of dried mud. These belong to someone light-footed, deliberate and cautious. They knew their way to this door in the dark." We returned to the church to speak once more with Reverend Hargrove. The old clergyman was clearly shaken by the latest attack, his hands visibly trembling as he prepared tea none of us would drink. Holmes stood before the fireplace, back straight, gaze fixed not on the Reverend but on a small portrait hanging above the mantel. "Reverend Holmes," said at last, "I must ask plainly, was there anything buried, concealed, or sealed in the church beyond what we already know? A body, perhaps, a secret grave, something more than the map and letter we discovered?" The Reverend hesitated. "I told you before I knew nothing of those hidden things. That map, that cavity behind the wall. It was all a revelation to me." "And Mr. Marley?" Holmes asked. Hargrove's lips pressed into a line. "He was here long before me, 25 years, perhaps more. If anyone knew what lay buried beneath our floor, it was he." Holmes nodded slowly. "And now someone has ensured he cannot speak." As we prepared to leave, Holmes stopped suddenly beside the north transept wall, the one where the second blood trail had appeared. He stared at it for a long time, unmoving. Then he reached out and tapped a section of the stone, not with force, but gently, rhythmically, like a pianist finding a lost chord. "What is it?" I asked. "There is another hollow," he said. "Here, this section rings different from the rest." Lestrade leaned in. "You think there's something else behind the wall?" "I think," Holmes murmured, "that our killer is not just guarding a crime. They are guarding a history. And every stone we touch brings us closer to whatever it is they have long tried to forget or deny. He turned away, the wind lifting his coat as he stepped out into the growing day. I followed, casting one last glance back at the stained glass window overhead. The image of St. Michael stood there, sword raised in triumph over darkness. But below it, the stone still bore a faint smear of red, like a warning etched by time itself. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The following day dawned, sullen and gray, with a persistent drizzle that turned Baker Street into a river of slick cobblestones and hurrying umbrellas. Holmes had slept little again, pacing our sitting room for hours, pausing only to jot cryptic symbols in his notebook or study the old documents retrieved from behind the altar wall. I knew the signs while he was circling something, narrowing in, waiting for a detail to present itself plainly. He lit his pipe and sat by the window, staring out at the mist that seemed to cloud even his mind. Then, quite suddenly, he rose. "We're going back to the church, Watson," he said firmly, "but not to look for clues. We're going to look for relationships, old ones, buried beneath the surface like everything else in this wretched place." I followed him without question. When Holmes spoke in that tone, I knew better than to slow the rhythm of his thoughts. We arrived at St. Matthias in the early afternoon, the sky still dripping, the grounds nearly deserted. Inside the chapel, the Reverend Hargrove waited for us, clearly uneasy with the turn the case had taken. Agatha Kilburn had since been taken to the yard, and Mr. Marley remained unconscious. The quiet had returned, but it felt false, like the silence that follows the fall of a heavy curtain on a stage where the final act has yet to be played. Holmes asked to see the church's oldest records: births, deaths, burials, and marriages. At first, Hargrove resisted, claiming many of the older volumes were crumbling and irrelevant. But Holmes was insistent. "Not for the details, Reverend," he said, "but for the patterns. You may have forgotten, but buildings do not. They carry the names, the sins, the silences of those who built and buried their secrets inside them." We were led down into the vestry archifer, cramped, dry chamber lined with shelves of leather-bound books and fading scrolls. The air was thick with dust and old incense. Holmes scanned the spines quickly, then pulled out 3 volumes dated between 1860 and 1885. He spread them across the long oak table and began to turn the pages, eyes darting, fingers moving with precise rhythm. "What are you hoping to find?" I asked, leaning beside him. "Names," he said, "or, more importantly, name. There is someone missing from this picture, Watson. A figure who never appeared at the scene, left no footprints, spoke no alibis, and yet whose shadow is cast across every event in this church." Then he stopped suddenly, his finger resting on a brittle page. Here, he read aloud: "Catherine Hollowaged, 19, found dead beneath northern transept wall. Cause presumed illness. No witnesses. Body interred under direction of Elias Nettle and presiding Bishop Harrow, 1872. He turned the page, and here again Marcus Hollow, father, occupation, parish gravedigger, dismissed from duties. He looked up at me, eyes narrowed. She was buried beneath the wall, Watson, not in the graveyard, inside the church itself. I felt a cold chill sweep through me. So the story in the letter, the one about sealing something beneath the wallet, wasn't a metaphor. No, Holmes said grimly. It was a confession. They buried her there and scrubbed the record clean. But the Father Marcus Holloway would never have forgotten. They dismissed him to silence him, but he remained close, possibly hidden in plain sight. I followed Holmes as he stood and paced the room. He may have changed his name, disguised his identity. For all we know, he may have been living among them, watching. And when Elias Nettle found that old letter, that map, that hidden truth, he became a threat. A man trying to make peace with the past, unaware someone else had never forgiven it. Holmes stopped, then turned to Reverend Hargrove, who was the church's longest-serving groundskeeper before Mr. Marley. The Reverend blinked. I believe it was his uncle, a man named Martin Groves. He worked here decades ago. Quiet fellow, never married. Died suddenly, if I recall, just before I arrived. Holmes's face grew still. Groves, hollow, an easy transformation. And did Mr. Marley ever mention family beyond that uncle? No, Hargrove said. He was always alone. Lived in the cottage his uncle once used. Kept mostly to himself. Not surprising, Holmes murmured. The man was never a mere caretaker. He was a watcher. And when Nettle found the truth, Mr. Marley struck. But that wasn't the end. Someone else found out about Catherine Hollow, too. Perhaps Agatha Kilburn, or someone else we've yet to consider. And now, with Marley unconscious, the real killer has no more pawns left to move. He turned sharply to me. Watson, I must return to Baker Street. There is a letter I must draft immediately. You, however, will stay here and watch over the church. If anything stirs, anyone tries to reach the transept wall or the vestry, you are to stop them at once. I agreed, though uneasily. Holmes, what is it you're not telling me? He paused only a moment. That I fear the killer has not yet finished what they started. Marley was an attempt to tie off a loose end. But the biggest threat is still walking freely. And they know time is no longer on their side. As Holmes disappeared through the chapel doors, I sat quietly in the front pew, watching the candlelight flicker across the stone. The walls seemed to breathe with memory, and somewhere beyond them, a presence stirred, silent, buried, patient. Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes' grand strategy. The candlelight burned low as I sat in the nave of St. Matthias, listening to the stillness that hung like a veil over the chapel's arches. Holmes had departed nearly an hour earlier, leaving me with the quiet company of stone angels, shadowed pews, and the ticking fear that someone or something might emerge from that silence at any moment. I had posted myself near the north transept wall, the very one where the second weeping had occurred. Though the stone was now dry, I could still see the faint trace of reddish stain upon it, like a memory refusing to fade. Time passed slowly. The flickering of the candles made the shadows dance across the stone floor, and every creak of the building made my heart quicken. I shifted uneasily on the pew. Holmes had spoken with such certainty before leaving, but he had not told me his full plan. That was his way. He often withheld the final thread of a deduction until the moment he meant to pull it tight. All I knew was that I was not here to solve anything. I was bait. It was close to midnight when I heard it, a soft sound like footsteps padded by careful effort, not the tread of a vicar or constable. This was slower, more deliberate. I stiffened, reaching instinctively for the revolver in my coat, though I had no desire to use it unless I had to. I rose from the pew and turned toward the back of the church, eyes straining in the dim light. A figure moved near the vestry, cloaked in a long coat, face obscured beneath a broad hat. I stepped out from the pew and called, "Who's there?" The figure paused, then turned and fled through the side door. I followed without hesitation, the cold wind from outside slamming into me as I passed through the threshold. The courtyard was dark, but I saw the glint of motion, someone ducking behind the old bell tower. I gave chase, my footsteps echoing loudly now across the stone, my breath coming fast. Just as I rounded the tower, a hand reached out from the shadows and caught my coat. "Watson," Holmes whispered. "Easy. Let them go." I stumbled to a halt, shocked. "Holmes, you knew someone would come." He nodded, eyes gleaming. "I suspected. And I wanted them to believe they could move freely with you alone here. But they didn't come for you, Watson. They came to check the wall." We returned to the chapel immediately, Holmes moving swiftly to the transept. There, just beneath the stained stone, lay a small folded paper. He picked it up carefully and opened it. Inside was a list of names. Most were parishioners, but some I recognized from the earlier registries, and one in particular made Holmes stop. James Fallow, groundskeeper, 1859 to 1872. That was the man who buried Catherine Hollow. He looked up at me. "They weren't just coming to check the wall, Watson. They were retrieving this. It's a message, one that was never meant to be found again. A link in the chain that ties the crime of the past to the bloodshed of the present." Holmes went to the altar and placed the note beside the other documents we had already discovered. The pieces were aligning, slowly, deliberately, but something still tugged at him, a missing step. He paced back and forth in the chancel, muttering under his breath, his brow furrowed. Then, suddenly, he stopped. "We need to draw them in, Watson. Whoever they are watching, waiting. But fear will drive them to act rashly if they believe the truth is about to come out." He turned to Reverend Hargrove, who had just returned from the vicarage. "Reverend, I require your pulpit tomorrow morning." Hargrove blinked. "My pulpit?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, I will deliver your Sunday address. And in that address, I will imply that I have discovered the full truth behind Catherine Hollow, the Weeping Wall, and Elias Nettles' death. I will not name names, but I will suggest I intend to reveal all by sunset." The Reverend's eyes widened. "You mean to flush the killer out during service?" "No," Holmes said. "Immediately after, when they believe the entire congregation has heard what they have tried so hard to keep buried, they will have no choice but to act before evening. They may try to silence me, or destroy the final piece of evidence. Either way, we'll be waiting." That night, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street only briefly to rest and collect ourselves. I could not sleep, though I lay back on the couch with my eyes shut. I saw stone walls, old names in crumbling books, the blood-like stain across gray bricks, and the trembling eyes of Agatha Kilburn whispering, "I didn't kill him." Something dark and old coiled through this case, deeper than vengeance. Holmes remained by the fire, lost in thought, until the morning light crept across the floor. By the time we returned to the church, the chapel was already filling with parishioners. The news of Holmes's investigation had clearly spread, and people came not only for worship but for curiosity. Holmes stood calmly at the front of the pulpit as the congregation settled. Reverend Hargrove offered a brief prayer, then stepped aside. Holmes began slowly. His voice was clear, confident, and strangely serene. He did not speak of crime or accusation. Instead, he spoke of truth, how it sleeps, buried beneath years, and how it waits patiently for someone brave enough to exhume it. He talked of forgiveness and of how unconfessed sins do not fade with time, but ferment, rising again in different forms. The church fell into a hush so deep that I could hear the creak of the floorboards beneath the pews. Then he said, "By tonight, I believe we will know everything. What was hidden will be shown. The wall that weeps will no longer be silent. I only ask for patience, sand for courage." He stepped down from the pulpit. The service concluded without incident, but the eyes of the congregation, nervous glancing, spoke of something unspoken, something stirring. Back in the vestry, Holmes turned to Lestrade, who had been posted discreetly at the rear of the chapel. "Tonight," Holmes said softly, "we wait. I believe our guest will come just before dusk, and this time, Watson, they won't be running." Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. The evening air lay heavy over St. Matthias. Its quiet gardens sunk in golden haze as the sun dipped behind the bell tower. The last of the congregation had long since departed, leaving the chapel silent, almost reverent. Yet within its walls there was no peace. Holmes stood once more near the transept wall, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed not on the stone itself, but on the shadows beyond it. Lestrade had taken up his post behind the confessional, and I remained near the vestry door, heart ticking with a familiar blend of nervousness and anticipation. We were not merely waiting, we were poised. Holmes had not spoken much since the sermon. He seemed deep in a peculiar silence, as if something within him were circling ever closer to clarity. But I recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same one I had seen on the night he uncovered the Milverton scandal, and again in the case of the Norwood builder. It was the look of a mind on the brink of illumination, a man who had gathered every strand and was now waiting for the final knot to tighten. Still, he had not yet told me what he suspected, nor who he believed the true killer to be. The sky beyond the stained glass had begun to bruise with dusk when the chapel door creaked open. A figure stepped inside quietly. It was Reverend Hargrove. His shoulders were hunched, and his movements were unusually slow. Holmes did not turn at once, but I saw him lift his head slightly. "I thought it might be you," Holmes said calmly, as if they had arranged a meeting. Hargrove came forward a few steps, then paused near the front pew. His face was pale, more so than I had ever seen it, and his hands trembled faintly. "I had to come," he said. "I heard your words this morning. You said everything would be revealed tonight." "Yes," Holmes replied, still not turning, "and indeed it shall." The silence that followed was strange and taut. I could hear the ticking of the altar clock. Hargrove swallowed once and looked at the wall. "It's her, isn't it? Catherine Hollow. She's still there." Holmes turned now, slowly, and fixed the Reverend with a gaze so steady it made the older man falter. "Yes, and someone feared the consequences of that discovery. Someone who knew that if her burial became public, there would be questions about who ordered it, who allowed it, and who benefited from the silence that followed." The Reverend's lips parted, but no words came. Holmes stepped closer. Elias Nettle found the letter and the map. He meant to expose it, not to disgrace the church, but to set right an old wrong. But someone stopped him. Someone who stood to lose everything if that secret came to light. Someone who had spent years building a name, a position, a reputation. No. The word burst out of Hargrove, soft but desperate. No, you're wrong. Holmes's voice remained calm. I believe you were not the first to touch the truth, Reverend, but you were the last to act upon it. He turned slightly, gesturing for Lestrade. You weren't the one who killed Elias Nettle. That was done by the caretaker, Mr. Marley. His motive was personal. His family's disgrace, his niece's death, the lies that buried them. But when Marley saw that others were beginning to unearth the same history, he panicked. And so did you. Hargrove looked toward me, then away. I didn't know she was under the wall. I swear. Not until you said her name. But you did know about the records, Holmes continued, his tone tightening now. You saw Elias searching the archives. You may have even confronted him. When he died, you realized someone else might soon follow his path. Perhaps Agatha Kilburn. Perhaps even Watson or myself. So you cleaned the vestry. You burned pages. You planted misdirection. You weren't protecting a murderer, Reverend. You were protecting your church, your legacy. The Reverend stepped back, shaking his head slowly, but I could see it in his face. He had been found out. Not as a killer, perhaps, but as a conspirator in silence. Holmes stepped forward once more. The second wall bleeding, that was not Agatha Kilburn's doing alone, was it? The Reverend's voice came thin and hollow. She asked me for help. I said no. I told her it would only make things worse. But she was terrified. She said she heard voices at night, scratching, weeping. I thought perhaps a performance would calm her madness. I never poured a drop, but I let her do it. I told her which wall. There was a long silence. I've led this parish for 23 years, he whispered. Do you understand what it means to have built something to guide people, heal them, serve them only, to have one corpse beneath the stone tear it all down? Holmes's face did not soften. A corpse that was never meant to die that way. A girl buried in silence so others could speak in peace. At that moment, the chapel door creaked again. A constable entered quietly, tipping his hat. Inspector, we've found something. Lestrade stepped forward from his shadowed post. Where? In the caretaker's cottage. Beneath the floorboards. There's a locked box. It contains letters, Reverend, from Bishop Harrow to Elias Nettle, and more notes, confessions. One even bears your name. Hargrove closed his eyes. Holmes turned away, the moment passing like a shadow over the flame. He did not gloat, nor raise his voice. He only looked tired, like a man who had carried the truth too long. I did not come here to destroy a church, he said quietly, only to uncover what it buried. The Reverend bowed his head. And you've done that. God help us all. Holmes gave no reply. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. The next morning, Baker Street was hushed under a thick mist, the kind that seemed to muffle every wheel on cobblestone and every voice in the lane. I awoke to find Holmes already dressed, seated by the hearth with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. His eyes were focused but distant, and the embers reflected red in his pupils, making him seem momentarily otherworldly. The events of the previous night still lingered in my thoughts. Reverend Hargrove's weary confession, the locked box beneath the caretaker's floor, and the silence that followed Holmes's closing words. But as always, Holmes was not yet done. "There is a final thread, Watson," he said, without looking at me. "The curtain has fallen for some, but the true culprit, the one who wove this entire tale from behind the stage, has not yet bowed, and I believe they intend to vanish before nightfall." I stood, stretching stiff limbs. "You don't think it was Reverend Hargrove, then?" "No," Holmes said. "He is guilty of cowardice and concealment, but not of murder. The killing of Elias Nettle was not done to protect legacy, it was done out of vengeance. And it was carried out by someone with access, strength, and most importantly, rage. Mr. Marley was the hand. But I now believe the mind behind it still walks free." Holmes retrieved his coat and cane, and we departed without another word. As we made our way back to St. Matthias, the fog swirled like memory itself, heavy, shapeless, and full of the past. The church grounds were quiet. Only a single constable stood at the chapel door, who nodded as Holmes passed and gestured toward the vicarage. "Miss Agatha Kilburn has been returned." "Sir," the constable said, "Inspector Lestrade wanted you to speak with her again." Inside, the vicarage drawing-room was dim and cool. Agatha sat in a chair by the window, her expression unreadable. Gone was the fearful glimmer in her eyes. In its place was something harder, almost resigned. Holmes took the seat across from her and offered a faint, polite nod. "You were right to be afraid," he began, "but you've been afraid of the wrong person." She looked at him, her lips barely parting. "I suppose you'll tell me who that person is." "I believe you already know," Holmes said softly, "but I will say it aloud, so we're no longer playing in shadows." He leaned forward. "The one who has orchestrated these events, who prompted Mr. Marley's silence, who ensured Elias Nettle would not speak, and who attempted to destroy the last written evidences. Not a man of the cloth, nor the poor caretaker who now lies unconscious. It is a woman with deep roots in this village. A woman who knows every passage of the church and every whisper of its past." Agatha did not react at first, but I saw her hands curl into fists in her lap. "She did not act for glory nor power," Holmes continued. "She acted for family, for a name stained by a secret never meant to resurface." At last, Agatha spoke. "You mean Mrs. Levington?" Holmes nodded once. "The widow of the former Bishop Harrow, now living under her late husband's name, and regarded as a pious benefactor of the parish. She has the ear of the vestry board, funds the choir robes, and sits always in the third pew on the right." Agatha looked down. "She told me I was imagining things, that the wall was a symbol, nothing more. But when I started hearing noises, and then found the letter—" Her voice broke for a moment. "I went to her. I thought she'd help me." "But she threatened you," I said gently. Agatha nodded. "Said if I breathed a word, I'd be cast out. Said I was unstable, that I'd be locked away, just like my great-aunt had been." Holmes stood slowly. "Then it's time to make certain she doesn't have the chance to bury another truth." We left at once for Mrs. Levington's home, modest, ivy-wrapped cottage nestled near the edge of the churchyard. As we approached, Holmes slowed. The door was ajar. There were no lights inside. He raised a hand and stepped forward quietly. Inside, the air was stale, as if someone had not drawn breath in the room for hours. A teacup lay shattered on the floor. The fireplace was cold, and beside the mantelpiece an envelope had been pinned to the wall with a letter opener. Holmes pulled it down and opened it. His eyes moved quickly across the page. "She's running," he said. "What does it say?" I asked. "That she did what had to be done. That she kept the church alive when the past threatened to ruin it. That she has no regrets." He looked up. "She's gone to the chapel." We raced through the fogged streets, our footsteps echoing between the buildings as the mist clung to our coats. When we arrived, the church door stood wide open. Holmes entered first, his movements sharp and alert. The candles had not yet been lit for the evening. The air was damp and cold. At the transept wall, Mrs. Levington stood alone. She was dressed in gray, her hands pressed flat against the stone. Her shoulders were square, but her head was bowed, as though in prayer. "You knew it would come to this," Holmes said, voice steady. She did not turn. "I was there the night Catherine died. My husband said it was illness, but I saw the bruises, the fear. He buried her like waste beneath this wall, and I stood beside him, silent." Holmes approached cautiously. "So you silenced the ones who might uncover it." "I did what I had to," she said. "Elias wanted to make it public. Marley wanted to protect his niece's name. But I wanted peace for the parish, for what's left of it." "There is no peace built on silence," Holmes said quietly. "Only delay." She turned then. Her face was lined, proud, and weary all at once. "Then end it, Mr. Holmes. I won't run any farther." At that moment, Lestrade entered with 2 constables. Mrs. Levington offered no resistance as she was led away. She did not weep. She did not speak. But before stepping beyond the chapel threshold, she turned once more and looked back at the wall as if to bid farewell to the stone that had, for decades, hidden the secret of her shame. Holmes stood in silence beside me, and for the first time in days, the wall did not weep. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in, the final clue revealed. The following morning dawned with a thin, reluctant light. A heavy gray still hung over London, but there was a softness in the air, as though the storm had passed, and all that remained was the echo of rain. Holmes sat near the fire at Baker Street, not in triumph, but in a kind of meditative silence that often followed the closing of a case. The arrest of Mrs. Levington the night before had been handled quietly. Lestrade, ever eager to tidy loose ends, insisted it be kept from the newspapers. But I knew Holmes felt the matter was not yet concluded. He hadn't spoken much since our return, but I could see the thoughts turning behind his eyes. He'd been up before dawn, going over the old letters from Bishop Harrow, the registry entries from the church, and the torn page from Elias Nettle's diary that had been recovered from the caretaker's cottage. The final answer, it seemed, still hovered at the edge of understanding. I placed a fresh cup of tea by his elbow, hoping it might prompt a word from him. "Watson," he said suddenly, "tell me again what Agatha Kilburn said to you when you found her. That first evening, her exact words." I thought for a moment, replaying the memory. She said, "It's the wall, Doctor. The wall weeps. She cries every night, and no one hears her." Then she looked at the bricks and whispered, "It isn't finished yet." Holmes's eyes sharpened. He stood abruptly, pacing toward the window. Yes, that was it. It isn't finished yet. That was not the rambling of a mad girl. That was knowledge, something she'd seen or been told that didn't match the story we'd all accepted. I frowned, trying to follow. You think there's more behind the wall? I think, Holmes said slowly, that Elias Nettle didn't just find an old letter. He found something physical, something beneath the transept wall that confirmed what had been covered up and, perhaps, revealed even more than anyone expected. He returned to the table and pulled out a folded parchment. You remember the map from Nettle's papers? Look, here this marking beneath the altar wall, a symbol, faint, almost rubbed out, but it matches one of the Masonic signs used by church architects in the mid-1800s. It means double chamber, a second, space, sealed, hidden, a hidden room. I asked, startled. Holmes nodded. Or a hollow cavity within the wall itself. I suspect it was used to entomb not one body, but two. Catherine Hollow was not alone in death. Without another word, we were on our way back to St. Matthias. This time, we did not enter through the main chapel, but through the vestry, where Holmes requested tools from Lestrade's men. The inspector looked skeptical, but gave his reluctant approval. You'll be the death of my pension, Holmes, he muttered, though he moved aside. Holmes directed us to the base of the north transept wall. The blood-like stain from the weeping had dried into a faint rust mark. Holmes tapped at the stone carefully, listening. Then, again harder. The fourth brick from the bottom gave a slightly different tone. Hollow, here, he said quietly. This is the true heart of it. The constables pried the stone loose. It came away with surprising ease. Behind it, darkness, yonder, shallow cavity, perhaps 2 feet deep. Holmes reached in slowly, then withdrew his hand with something wrapped in oilcloth. He unrolled it gently on the floor. Inside was a stack of folded papers, an old rosary, and a small, dried leather pouch. He opened the pouch first. Bones, small, delicate. A child's hand. Lestrade turned pale. Good Lord, Holmes's voice was low. Catherine was pregnant, likely by someone of standing. Perhaps even the bishop himself. Her death wasn't illness. It was silencing. He turned to the papers. They were letters written in a woman's hand, addressed to Elias Nettle, and unsigned. Holmes scanned them quickly. From Mrs. Levington Confessions. She knew, perhaps not at first, but over time, the truth became unavoidable. The child was born dead or killed. Both were buried, hidden, made to disappear beneath the wall, so the bishop could continue untainted. Lestrade stood in silence. No one spoke. The weight of it filled the room like a second fog. Holmes looked at me. Now, Watson, it's finished. The wall has given up everything it once held. We stood together in the quiet that followed, the stones cold and still, but no longer hiding. For the first time since this case began, the silence felt honest, but healing. Chapter 15. The final gathering the next evening. A subdued hush settled over St. Matthias, as though the building itself sensed the close of something long buried. The great doors had been opened again under Holmes's instruction, and light from dozens of flickering candles danced across the nave, casting tall shadows on the stone walls that had once hidden more than memory. Only a select few had been summoned, those whose names had surfaced again and again in the investigation. Each one pulled toward the final knot Holmes was about to untangle. They arrived quietly, seated not as a congregation, but more like participants in a peculiar kind of tribunal. Reverend Hargrove sat near the front, head bowed in weariness, his eyes fixed on the floor. Agatha Kilburn hovered near the side aisle, her pale hands clasped tightly together. Inspector Lestrade stood beside Holmes, arms crossed, while Mrs. under guard but not yet formally charged, sat still and composed in the third pew, the very seat she had occupied for years. As if by force of habit, I stood at Holmes's side, unsure of what he planned to reveal, for though many truths had already come to light, there remained gaps, shadows between facts, filled only by suggestion and possibility. Holmes stepped slowly to the front, pausing beneath the pulpit, and surveyed the room with a stillness I had come to associate with the moment just before a revelation. "You are here," he began softly, "not merely as witnesses, but as keepers of a history no longer hidden. You each played a part, whether knowingly or not, to the preservation of a secret. Tonight, that secret must be laid bare, not for vengeance, but for truth." There was no sound except the low sputter of candle flames. Holmes turned toward Mrs. Levington. "You shielded your husband's reputation, but in doing so, you sacrificed the justice owed to 2 lives, Catherine Hollow and her unborn child. You feared that knowledge would destroy what the Church had built. And yet, look around you now. What has endured, endures still." She did not respond, only watched him with unreadable eyes. Then Holmes faced Hargrove. "You, too, Reverend, chose silence. You did not commit murder, but you helped perpetuate the lie. You removed documents, suppressed records, misdirected inquiries, not to protect yourself, but to shield the crumbling walls of your ministry from scrutiny." "I thought I was doing what was right," the Reverend murmured, "to preserve the good." "But good cannot grow from a grave," Holmes said. "Not one left unmarked." He turned next to Agatha Kilburn. "You were the voice no one believed, the girl who heard weeping and was told she was imagining it. But your madness, as they called it, was the echo of truth and old sorrow that still clung to the stone." Agatha did not speak, but her eyes glistened. Holmes stepped away from the front and paced slowly down the center aisle. Mr. Marley, though absent, acted with a personal fury. His niece had been wronged, his family disgraced. His violence, though condemned, came from the wound of injustice. But violence is never a balm, and silence, even when born of grief, breeds more darkness. He reached into his coat and drew from it the small bundle recovered from the hidden chamber. He did not open it fully, only enough to show the delicate rosary and the edge of a faded letter. These were meant to be buried forever, but the dead do not rest while the living carry lies. There was a long pause. The weight of it pressed against all of us, and for once, even Lestrade did not shift or clear his throat. Holmes let the silence settle, as though giving everyone a moment to breathe in the finality of truth. Then he spoke again, quieter still. "The purpose of this gathering is not judgment. That belongs to the law. But there is something sacred in bearing witness. Catherine Hollow died without a voice. Her story was sealed behind brick and stone. Tonight she has been heard." He looked up at the great window above the altar, where pale moonlight now filtered through the colored glass. "This chapel is no longer a tomb. It is a place of light again." At last he turned to Lestrade. "The papers will go to the yard. The remains, once cleared, must be reburied properly with a name, a stone, a place to rest." Lestrade gave a solemn nod. Slowly, the gathering began to dissolve. Reverend Hargrove left without a word, followed by Agatha, whose steps were lighter than I had seen before. Mrs. Levington remained seated for a time, staring at the flickering candles, as though unsure if she should rise at all. Eventually, she, too, was led out under gentle escort. Holmes and I remained for a moment longer. "You've solved many cases, Holmes," I said quietly, "but rarely have I seen you speak so plainly." Almost reverently, he gave a faint smile. "There are times, Watson, when deduction alone is not enough, when logic must yield to acknowledgement. This was not merely a mystery, it was a burial. And burials, I think, deserve more than conclusions. They deserve closure." Outside, the fog had lifted. The moon shone clearly now, silver and whole. We walked back in silence, our footsteps echoing softly against the stones, and for once, there was nothing left to say. Chapter 16: The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime, though. Following afternoon brought with it a sharp wind and a sky streaked with pale blue, an unusual clarity after so many days of fog and gloom. Back at Baker Street, Holmes stood at the center of our sitting room with a small stack of papers spread across the table. The fire burned low in the grate, and Mrs. Hudson had brought up tea, which Holmes hadn't touched. He was focused, absorbed in that final act of unveiling that he always reserved until every piece was in place. I knew from experience that this was the moment when Holmes, after having lived inside the labyrinth of a mystery, emerged at last to lay its paths bare for the rest of us. "I believe, Watson," he began without looking up, "it's time we walk the path backwards, spool the tapestry to its first thread. Only then will the full shape of the crime reveal itself." I nodded and sat across from him, notebook in hand. Holmes began to pace, one hand behind his back and the other occasionally lifting to gesture toward. His words came slowly at first, deliberate and clear. "It begins, of course, with Catherine Hollow," he said, "a young woman of little means, taken in by the church and given lodging under Bishop Harrow's patronage, a position of protection, but also one of vulnerability. She was not merely a servant, Watson, she was his mistress. And when she fell pregnant, the bishop, fearing ruin, sought to erase the consequence of his actions." Holmes paused by the window, looking out at the street below. "We know now from the recovered letters that Catherine gave birth within the chapel itself, perhaps in secret, perhaps with the help of one or two trusted women. The child did not live. Whether it was born still or met another fate, we may never know with certainty. But what followed is, without doubt, the bishop ordered both bodies interred beneath the transept wall, hidden within a double cavity designed for structural stability, never meant to hold the dead." I felt a chill at the thought. "Despite the fire, Reverend Hargrove," Holmes continued, "arrived many years later and may have discovered fragments of the story, perhaps only rumors. He never questioned the layout of the chapel, nor the few inconsistencies in its records, but others did. Elias Nettle, the amateur historian, came across an unsigned letter in the church's archives. It led him to the map hidden in the vestry cabinet, the one marked with the old Masonic symbol. He understood its meaning, or enough of Etond, began his quiet investigation." Holmes moved back toward the table and pointed to the notes laid out in careful rows. But someone else discovered his progress. Someone who had more to lose than anyone else. Mrs. Levington, widow to the late Bishop Harrow. She had built her entire post-marriage life upon the grace and reverence of his legacy. A legacy that would collapse under the truth. She didn't kill him, though I offered. No, Holmes agreed. She lacked the physicality and perhaps the will to commit murder. But she knew. She realized what Elias had found. And so she turned to an old Aletha Church's caretaker, Mr. Marley. Now here lies the complication. Holmes paused and took a slow breath. Marley's motivations were not simple loyalty. They were rooted in personal grievance. His niece had been among the girls sheltered by the bishop's charity. She died shortly after being dismissed from service under suspicious circumstances, bruised and silent. Marley had always believed she'd been wronged by someone within the church. When Mrs. Levington revealed what Nettle had uncovered, Marley saw a chance to prevent the story from surfacing. Not to protect the bishop's name, but to preserve what remained of his niece's dignity. He feared the scandal would stain her memory further, and so he killed Nettle, I said quietly. Holmes nodded. Yes, a quick blow in the night. But even then, the secret was not safe. Miss Agatha Kilburn had read part of the same letter, and had begun to suspect something terrible. Her mind, already fragile, clung to the weeping wall as the symbol of what had been hidden. She was not mad, Watson, merely overwhelmed. Holmes returned to the window. The light caught the edge of his profile, etching a sharp line from brow to jaw. Mrs. Levington, fearing that Agatha might speak too much or draw the wrong sort of attention, played a quiet but sinister game. She cast doubt upon the girl's sanity, even tried to frighten her into silence. But Agatha was too consumed by what she believed to be a haunting to remain quiet. That's why she enacted the second weeping, I said, pouring water against the wall. Holmes allowed a brief smile. Yes, a child's trick, but one rooted in desperation. And Hargrove, ever the protector of the church's dignity, enabled it, hoping to appease her without drawing further scandal. Holmes returned to the table and took up the small bundle that had been recovered from behind the wall. He held it gently, his fingers resting on the old rosary. This is the heart of it. Not the bones or the letters, but the silence they represent. Each person in this story acted from fear of exposure, of loss, and yet each silence became another stone in a wall that could not help but weep. He looked up at me now, his expression unreadable. You see, Watson, deduction is not always the solving of riddles. Sometimes it is the breaking of chains unseen, chains that bind people to the past. We broke them, or perhaps we merely uncovered where they were tied. I sat in silence, struck by the gravity of it all. This had not been a case like others. There was no treasure, no stolen gem, no fugitive in disguise. Only memory, pain, and finally, the quiet act of remembering what was meant to be forgotten. Holmes poured a cup of tea at last and handed it to me. Now, he said, the question remains whether justice will follow truth, or if this too will be tucked away behind polite conversation and drawn curtains. And you, I asked, are you done with the matter? For now, he said simply, the wall has spoken. I am merely its translator. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The days that followed moved slowly, like dust settling after a long storm. London, ever restless, carried on without notice of the events that had unfolded at St. Matthias. For most, it was simply another old church with whispers in its stones. But for those who had witnessed the truth behind its walls, the silence now carried a different weight. Holmes, as was his way, returned quickly to routine. Yet I could see in his manner that this case had left an imprint on him more subtle than most, but no less lasting. News of the discovery made its way to the proper channels. Scotland Yard took quiet custody of the remains, and within a week, arrangements were made for a proper burial. The child's bones were placed beside Catherine Hollow's, beneath a modest marker in the parish graveyard. No grand eulogy was given, no crowd stood in mourning, only a small gathering. Holmes, myself, Inspector Lestrade, and Agatha Kilburn stood at the edge of the plot as the earth was turned once more. The air was still. No words were necessary. Mrs. Levington's fate was settled without fanfare. She was not charged with murder. There was no direct evidence to prove she had ordered Elias Nettle's death. But obstruction of justice, suppression of evidence, and years of deceit were enough for the Crown to act. She was removed from the vestry board, stripped of her influence, and quietly committed to the care of a private institution on the outskirts of Surrey. Some called it mercy, others punishment. Holmes merely called it consequence. As for Mr. Marley, the poor caretaker never recovered. He remained in a state of deep confusion at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, unaware of the stir his actions had caused. No formal trial was held for him. The Yard concluded, with Holmes's confirmation, that his crime had not been premeditated, but driven by a fractured heart and years of buried guilt. He was left under care, and no one came forward to claim him. Holmes remarked once that sometimes the law cannot mend what the heart has shattered. Reverend Hargrove submitted his resignation shortly after the burial. He wrote a single letter to the bishop's office, citing illness and spiritual fatigue. I suspected the truth had weighed upon him for many years, and though he had escaped the hand of the law, his conscience had rendered its own judgment. His departure from St. Matthias was quiet. No farewell sermon, no ceremony, only a note on the chapel door, thanking the congregation for their kindness and prayers. Agatha Kilburn, the girl once thought mad, remained at the vicarage for some weeks. In the absence of the Reverend and the Levington influence, she began to thrive. With Holmes's recommendation, arrangements were made for her to join a small charitable teaching school in Kent, where she could train to be a governess. I received a letter from her weeks later, clear, warm, and full of hope. It was the first time I had seen her words without tremble or fear. She ended the letter with a single line: "The wall no longer weeps." One afternoon, as autumn began to lay its hand upon the trees, Holmes and I sat again by the fire at Baker Street. The air carried the scent of rain on brick, and the wind hummed faintly through the eaves. Holmes sat with his pipe, unusually reflective, staring into the hearth as though some thought refused to leave him. "Do you believe justice was done, Holmes?" I asked quietly. He tapped the bowl of his pipe gently against the edge of the chair before answering. "Justice, Watson, is rarely a clean affair. It does not always arrive with gavel and sentence. Sometimes it comes in the form of truth uncovered, dignity restored, or a name given to the forgotten. In this case, I believe justice crept in quietly, without glory, but with purpose." I nodded, though part of me still felt unsettled. And yet, no headlines, no public reckoning. It will all fade again. Holmes looked at me then, his eyes thoughtful, not for those who mattered, not for Agatha, not for the child, and not for the stones of that church which will now hold memory, not silence. That is more than many get. We sat in silence for a long time after that. Outside, the wind had grown colder. The world turned on, as it always did. But something about this case lingered in the bones, like a hymn half sung or a name carved faintly into wood. It was a reminder that not all crimes were the face of greed or hatred. Some are born of sorrow, of silence. And in those cases, the greatest act of justice is not to punish, but to reveal. Chapter 18, Holmes' final reflection. It was a week after the burial when the last thread of the case quietly knotted itself shut. The skies over London had begun to take on the yellow-gray hue of early November, and the days grew shorter with each turn of the clock. Holmes and I were seated in our usual corners of the sitting-room at Baker Street, he with his violin across his knees, tuning it absent-mindedly, and I with a stack of medical journals I had every intention of reading but never quite opened. I had thought the case of St. Matthias concluded, wrapped up in its melancholy justice. But Holmes, as ever, found the stillness afterward even more fertile for thought than the noise of the chase. "You know, Watson," he said after a long silence, plucking a low note, "there was one last deception buried within that church." I looked up from my chair, surprised. "You think there's more still?" "Not a new crime," he said with a faint smile, "but an old lie that was believed even by those closest to it, including us." He rose and walked to the mantel, taking down the small sealed envelope that had been recovered with the pouch and rosary. "Do you remember the handwriting of the letters addressed to Elias Nettle?" "Yes, delicate script, feminine. We believed them to be from Mrs. Levington." Holmes held up the envelope. "And yet, this final letter, it was never opened. It bore no seal, only a fold. And it was not written by Levington. It was Catherine's." He placed the letter on the table before me and opened it carefully. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. It was not a confession nor a plea. It was a birth record, a simple note detailing the arrival of a child, a daughter, born quietly, living but frail, wrapped in a blanket, stitched with blue crosses. I looked up sharply. "Then the child lived." "For a time, yes," Holmes said quietly. "The letters from the hidden cavity are clearer now. Catherine feared exposure. She had no allies left. The bishop was already distancing himself. She wrote to Elias Nettle not as a historian, but as a friend, a man she trusted. She begged him to help her find safety, but he arrived too late." Holmes returned to the window. "What happened next is conjecture, but informed. I believe the child died in the days that followed, whether from illness or neglect. Catherine, overcome with grief, took her own life, or was silenced, though we cannot say by whom with certainty." I sat back in my chair, the weight of it sinking in. "Then Nettle returned years later, not out of curiosity, but guilt." Holmes nodded. "And perhaps to make amends. But the church, in its desperation to protect its reputation, ensured that the truth, once again, would be sealed away." He fell quiet, and for a moment, the soft creak of the violin's strings as he adjusted them filled the silence. Then he said, Watson, do you know why the wall wept? I blinked at the question. You mean the phenomenon? No, he said gently. I mean in metaphor. The wall wept because the living refused to grieve, because what should have been mourned was buried instead. The stones held sorrow that no man dared to speak aloud. His tone was almost reverent. I had seen Holmes deliver stunning deductions, reveal murderers in drawing rooms, and outwit the most devious criminals. But rarely had I seen him linger in the emotional shadows left behind. This case, I realized, had touched something within him, something not of logic, but of justice of another kind. And now, I asked, do you think it will be forgotten again? No, he said, because you shall write it. I blinked. Me, he smiled faintly. Who else, my dear friend? The tale is not fit for the newspapers. The Yard would prefer it remain obscure. But the world has long trusted the pen of Dr. John Watson to carry truth in its quietest and most enduring form. Let it be known not as scandal, but as memory. Let Catherine Hollow live again in words. I felt the sting of emotion rise, unexpected. I will write it, I said softly. Holmes turned back to his violin, setting bow to string. The opening notes of a slow melody floated into the room, mournful and low. Outside the window, the light had faded entirely. The lamplighters moved along the street below, and the world retreated once more into quiet as I reached for my pen. I glanced at Holmes's profile, lit by firelight, the violin tucked beneath his chin, the music rising gently in the hush of evening. This case had ended without applause or headlines, but in the simple recovery of truth, and in the act of remembrance, there was a deeper triumph. And so I wrote, beginning with the first words, I always did. It was on a particularly gray October morning that Sherlock Holmes turned to me and said, Watson, I have received a letter, most unusual, ... single quotes.